What's going on?
He ain't saying her kids are dead.
Are the kids in the house? What? You got a kid right there. Clearing the house. You got another one in here.
Another person?
Yes.
It felt like I was in a horrible nightmare.
I ran out, I couldn't see with nothing else.
I touched him and he's cold. My gut said, get out of here.
The suspect was prepared to do what they had to, and they were going to kill anybody in their way.
For those most affected by a homicide,
They were good men. It doesn't make sense.
the first 48 is just the beginning.
We believe that the victims knew who the killers were.
Right there, creeping across.
We had the killer on camera.
He is a man on a mission.
Why would his friend kill Darius? It was impossible. Impossible.
She clearly stated that it was a female voice.
Why did you tell the 911 operator that you heard things? I needed to convince the jury that the ex-girlfriend had nothing to do with this murder.
This is the story of the fight for justice.
It just takes one person to not believe in the case, and there would be no conviction.
In the weeks, months, and years,
I was in a homicide about 2.5 years. If you give me something, I won't put it down until it's done. So I love being a detective. You get a case and you take that drive and you want to solve it. You want to know why a crime happened.
What's up?
So, supposedly the two victims in here are brothers.
Okay.
The victim's mom was here when we got here. She was in the driveway and hysterical. One of our victims is on the couch, and then in the back bedroom on the right.
Okay. Appreciate it.
When I walked into the house, the first victim was on the couch. He was still wrapped up in his sleeping bag. You could clearly see he had one gunshot wound to the top of his head.
I'm gonna say this is the younger guy.
Yeah.
Which is Christopher.
21-year-old Christopher Smith, known as CJ, was a high school graduate and the youngest of 6.
Hit that like button, that subscribe button.
He enjoyed vlogging with his girlfriend on social media and had plans to go to film school.
It looks like he could have been sleeping.
I mean, it was like they just came in and just went.
He was just laid out, and you see a gunshot wound to his head. I mean, that straight up looks like an execution. Limber and I have worked several homicides together. He's not the type that's gonna just give up and quit if something's too hard. And I personally enjoy being that person that is gonna keep going and going, putting in the time and effort to solve the crime.
I'm assuming that's Darius.
Yeah.
28-year-old Darius Miles Jr. was CJ's older brother. He worked as a truck driver and had a side job fixing cars. He leaves behind 4 children.
Does he have multiples? Yeah, he's got multiples.
Darius was shot 4 times in his arm, leg, chest, and head.
The wounds can tell you things. For Darius, the wounds were consistent with him being awake. It appeared that when whoever came into that doorway, Darius put his hand up and he received several rounds through the hand and striking him in the chest and the head and ending his life.
I can't imagine what it was like for Darius in his final moments when you see someone at your door and they just start shooting at you and there's nothing you can do.
We got a projectile over here. And casings.
Mm-hmm.
One here in this basket, one here in this basket.
The team finds only 3 .40 caliber casings in the bedroom.
There's gotta be more cases.
That is extremely odd. I thought whoever killed the victims picked the shell casings up because they don't want to be caught.
He might have been the first one to take it in the head out there,
CJ on the couch was shot once,
and then he started eating rounds.
and Darius was shot numerous times. The killer almost emptied an entire mag into him.
With Darius, it's his personal. I think it was isolated towards him.
It appeared that the suspect was mentally prepared to do what they had to kill Darius, and they were going to kill anybody in their way. It's a very passionate crime.
I mean, nothing's stolen, nothing's out of place. There was no forced entry.
We believe that the victims knew who the killers were.
So all the next of kin's here for them?
Mm-hmm.
So we needed the family's help to start looking into who may have done this.
I'm Corporal Limber with Gwinnett County Police Homicide, okay? I'm the one that's handling the case.
It's cold in there. It feels like death. It's dark.
Me being the matriarch of this family, usually I'm the person that consoles. That's the first time ever I couldn't console my children because I didn't have it.
It was just silent.
I think I was in shock. How could this happen to us?
When I came in, I had to unlock both the locks.
The front door, everything was locked up.
Yes, everything locked. The only access point was the garage because they had a code to it.
That stood out to me because in order for the killer to come into that house, they had to know that code. They had to have that intimate knowledge of how to get into that house.
And she knows that passcode.
One of the family members believed it may have been one of Darius's ex-girlfriends.
Since the history of that relationship is in trouble.
When the police asked me who did I thought did this, her name was the very first name I thought of.
She came over here trying to fight him.
About a week or two earlier, there was some issues with them arguing, her beating the door, trying to get back into the home.
We called the police. She lied to the police and told the police he tried to fight her. My son don't hit women. My other son that she killed is the one that helped pull her out the house. She knew the code to the garage. That's how she was able to get in a month ago.
And he called me last night at 9:08 and said, pray for me because I'm about to tell her I can't with her no more. And then she's not here. Like, you're the only one.
He got 3 baby mamas. All them baby mamas came here. She the only one not here at this crime scene.
It was leading down that road. Maybe this ex-girlfriend was mad because of an argument. And given the fact that Darius was shot multiple times, it could be a crime of passion. She fit the profile for it.
We've got to go talk to her. Trying to keep an open mind about everything, but no forced entry into the home. She's the only one who has the code to the garage.
Four hours in.
Hey, how's it going?
Are you the sister? I'm the lawyer.
If you're labeled as a person of interest in a crime and you go out and you get an attorney immediately, does that make you guilty? No, it doesn't. But the possibility was there.
When was the last time you saw Chris or Darius?
Well, he came over my house last night.
Darius's ex-girlfriend agrees to talk.
There's really no mold that any one person can fit into to commit a crime. So you have to look at their statements.
He got there, what was it, 12 maybe? We hung out in his car. Went to the QT down the street. Got a Sprite, candy. Came back to my house and hung out, drunk a little bit, and that was it. Didn't leave till 3 a.m. Whatever happened after that, I don't know.
Motive is one of the top thoughts that go through your head. Was it an argument?
What kind of relationship did y'all have?
I mean, we didn't have a good one. We just argue a lot because we have a lot of differences. And at this point in time, we're taking a little break. Darius, his family, they don't know what they're talking about and they're upset right now. I don't know why they would even think. I have 2 kids by this man. He helps me with them.
Right.
Do you know how vital that is for a mother?
It appeared she was emotionally torn between being angry and being sad.
Now let's explore these explanations she provided and go from there.
The next morning,
we followed up with Quick Trip. Video surveillance footage shows Darius inside the store. The footage from outside shows his vehicle, and it shows 2 people in the car.
Everything she told us checked out.
It can be a letdown. You know, we thought we had a good lead, but at this point, you got to regroup a little bit and try and find another road to go.
Then,
Hey,
Tyrene reaches out to Limber.
okay.
I was able to get 5 hours of sleep. And when I woke up, plain as day, it's like God said, "Where's Walter?"
Tyrene noticed the victim's friend, Walter, dropped off the face of the planet at the time of the homicide.
All right, thank you. Walter lived with the victims for a period of time.
So it would stand to reason he would maybe know the garage code.
Yeah.
Family is very important to me. I have 6 of my own children. My husband has 1 and a stepdaughter. We are a big family. CJ was the baby of the family. Very happy young man. Very energetic, entertaining, loved music, loved dancing. At our church, he was a praise leader for the youth. And Darius was the glue of the family. The one that kept everybody together. Even there are times when he's checking on me to make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. This is a book of text messages that me and Darius shared. At any given time, he'll be texting me, "Hey, good morning, let me know when you're awake," or "Good morning, love you, Mom." Darius took pride in being the older brother for CJ. CJ, he wanted to be just like Darius. I mean, if you look at all their photos together, that's exactly what they did all the time, was embrace. Big brother, little brother. They were good men. They were workers. They loved family. They loved God. And to have their life cut short just because it doesn't make sense. At that time, I began to question God. I couldn't sleep. Every time I would try to attempt to close my eyes, I saw my son laying there murdered. And my mind just began to play out what may have happened that night.
His last name was Walter Hill.
We knew that the other doors were locked, so if someone knew the key code to the garage, they would be on the list of people to call.
He has a car.
See what we get.
I was able to run the license plate of his Jetta through the Flock data system, which is a license plate recognition software.
Yeah, that's Walter's car. He was captured on the interstate camera, license plate reader, going towards Alabama.
traveling out of the state of Georgia within a few hours of this murder. Our radar is kind of, it's dinging at us.
At that point, Walter became a person of interest. Why would you leave that quickly?
"28-year-old Walter Hill played varsity football in high school before becoming a security guard. He and his high school girlfriend have 3 children. He has no prior convictions.
Please leave your message for
Walt.
Hey, Walt.
Walter was nowhere to be found. This was someone close to us. A month prior to the tragedy, Walter and his family was here at my home, playing spades at my kitchen table and watching the Super Bowl. Where could this young man be all of a sudden?
With the first 48 winding down.
If you're looking at the victim's house, this is the house to the right.
We got video from the surrounding houses of the homicide scene.
Their front door, and then their garage is right here. Creeping across.
It looks like a ghost is going through the screen.
Light comes on.
That's a 339. Motion light.
20 minutes after the visitor first appears.
Right there. Runs across. That's right about 4 a.m.
We knew that we had the killer on camera.
Moments later.
Right here is the car. Leaving right after the suspect is seen running away from the house.
That's our suspect vehicle.
You zoom in a little bit.
2 days into the investigation.
Another house up the street from Darius and CJ had a camera that was in color. We were able to see a dark blue color car.
Walter's car on Vlog's dark blue. Everything right now is pointing towards Walter. But Walter was good friends with Darius. We just don't know the motive.
It was a brutal crime, and it just made the question of why stick out more than any other case.
One week later.
Okay. All right, thank you. Take care. I was talking to Darius's mom. I said, if Walter may be behind all this, what do you think his motive would be? And without skipping a beat, she goes, jealousy.
Walter was displaced. He had been with his girlfriend for over 13 years, the mother of his children. They had broken up.
She goes, every time he would come over, he would say, I wish I had what you had. I wish I had the family you had, the money, the friends.
His demeanor was different. He was very disrespectful.
Come on, man. It's not jealousy. You don't smoke 2 guys over jealousy.
I've never had a case where somebody murdered 2 of their best friends out of just sheer jealousy.
Detective Limber.
9 days after the double homicide.
Hello, this is Walter Hill. You gave me a call?
When Walter called me back, I was actually shocked.
First of all, do you know why I'm calling?
It was hopeful that he'll be forthcoming with us.
I think I do. I've heard about Darius.
All right, so what were you doing like the day, I guess the weekend of the homicide? On the 28th?
Yeah, I was working security. Marietta at a place called, I believe.
Walter gives the name of a business, an hour's drive from Darius and CJ's home.
It was from 7 to 7, 7 a.m., 7 p.m.
Okay. And then after that, did you go anywhere?
I went to a hotel, Night Inn.
Okay, so Saturday night, After you get off work, did you go straight to your hotel?
Actually, yeah. I actually went straight to the hotel that night.
Okay. Do you remember what time you got up Sunday morning?
It was around 5:30.
Do you carry anything?
No, not at the moment. The gun I actually had got stolen back in December.
What kind of gun was it?
It was a 40.
You just gave me the caliber that was used to murder the 2 victims. I mean, you couldn't get in any better than that. A little suspicious.
So, what do you think happened?
Darius was a quiet, laid-back guy. He minded his business, so I couldn't tell you too much.
All right, I appreciate it, man. You have a good night, okay?
All right, you too.
All right, bye.
Him calling me back opened this case up dramatically.
Anytime that suspect gives you a statement, we're always happy because even if it's wrong information, at least it's information that we can show is not correct.
"19 days in,
We just picked up video from the Knights Inn where Walter was staying. There's Walter. The time on the video right now is 4:20. And 4:20 is pretty consistent with the time that he would have left the homicide scene. Walter's going to his room. 6 minutes have elapsed. There he goes with his tote.
He told us that he didn't leave that night.
4:27. Looks like he's leaving in a hurry to get out of there.
But right after the homicide, he grabs 2 totes, throws them in the car, takes off.
Yeah, 4:31, he's gone. And he's on the highway heading out west.
Walter made the fatal error of telling us where he was staying and saying that he never left. The video that we got doesn't corroborate his statement.
But we gotta have some more information that physically puts Walter at the scene. Your cell phone is a wealth of knowledge. We can serve a search warrant to find out where that phone may have been.
One month later,
So victim's house right here, cell tower's right here.
Walter's records come in.
You can see his movements going towards the victim's house, around the victim's house, and he goes all the way back to the Knights Inn at the same time that I have video of him taking all his stuff, and he's on his way out of Georgia.
Yeah.
At that point, Walter was our killer. The cell phone records were key. And given the totality of everything, that gave us enough to get an arrest warrant for Walter Hill.
Two weeks into the search for Walter, U.S. Marshals locate his car, abandoned in Texas.
I just wanted to call and let you know that we finished that vehicle that's out here in our processing lot. We came across a bag that contained 6 fired .40 caliber cartridge cases.
The same caliber as the murder weapon.
That was the best feeling. Every detective, that is what you look for. You look for that physical piece of evidence to tie your suspect to the case.
I was like, no way, that can't be possible. We were overjoyed. You know, we got him, we nailed him.
The next morning, after staking out the home of Walter's sister,
The U.S. Marshals, along with our Sheriff's Department, were able to locate, track down Walter.
What's going on, Walter?
Any detective wants to get a confession. My goal is to get him to talk, to find a motive as to why he did it.
And that would complete the story.
I honestly don't know what I'm here for.
So, just break it down to you 2 friends were murdered.
Okay.
Where were you March 28th?
You asking me a question I can't recall, to be honest.
There you are. Right there. There you are. You lied to me. You said that you never left your hotel that night.
I didn't tell you that.
Yeah, you did.
I actually went straight to the hotel that night.
Do you remember what time you got up Sunday morning?
It was around 5:30.
I mean, Walter, what happened?
I have no idea.
He didn't really give me any sense of anything. You know, he was very cold. You know, there was a shell of a person, but there was nothing inside. So when he didn't change his demeanor, then we changed tactics.
Were you jealous of his life?
He had everything you didn't. He had a house. He had a job. He had friends. He took care of his kids. He had an income. And what did you have? You had nothing. You had your 3 kids, and you left your ass in October.
They wanted to break Walter down and try and hit a nerve somewhere to get Walter to open up.
But he would not break. He had no emotion. You know, he kind of gave that, I'm not jealous of them. I'm better than them.
I can talk to a lawyer now.
Sure.
All right, Walter. So you're being charged with the murder of Darius Miles and Chris Smith.
It was definitely a sense of relief.
See you in court.
It was like I finally could breathe, like I had been suffocating.
At that point, we handed over to DA's office, and then you put your faith in the attorney who's going to prosecute it.
Ag assault.
When I initially reviewed the case, I felt confident that Walter Hill did commit these murders.
So we got the shadowy figure going into the house at...
The physical and forensic evidence was extremely strong.
Started to flee his hotel around 4:20. They found shell casings in his car. But the biggest missing piece of the puzzle was going to be explaining to the jury why Walter committed the murders.
Not having a strong motive was going to cast doubt on everything else that we have.
It just takes one person to not believe in the case, and we would have a hung jury.
Three years after the murders of C.J. Smith and Darius Miles, the trial of Walter Hill begins.
We had to convince the jury that even if we don't know why Walter went in there to kill Darius, Walter was capable of going in there and killing Darius.
Does the defense wish to make an opening?
I do, Judge.
But the defense does not have to prove anything. And a good way to discredit the state's case is to present a case that's more believable to the jury.
Why would Walter, his friend, kill Darius? For 3 years, I have known it was impossible for Walter to have done it because there is a phone call.
We were a little surprised by the defense's opening statement.
This is at 4:41 that afternoon, Francis.
The day the bodies were discovered. There was a 911 call made by one of Darius's sisters.
My brother is in trouble. When we were on the phone, he was in an argument with... he was in an argument with someone? Okay, with a female.
She clearly stated that it was a female voice and not a male's voice. It did kind of raise some red flags for me.
It didn't happen the way they said. Doing something.
He was trying to put the blame on one of Darius' ex-girlfriends and take the blame off of Walter Hill.
And the 911 call supports that theory that Darius' ex-girlfriend was involved in the murder. It's the story that's really familiar with us, a scorned ex-lover, and that's certainly a better explanation of why.
I needed to convince the jury that the ex-girlfriend had nothing to do with this murder. We called Darius' sister to the stand. The jury needed to hear from her mouth why she made the call to 911.
My sister called me. She said something's wrong. Get the police over there, don't ask no questions. So I hung up the phone and I called 911. I told her I was on the phone with my brothers.
But she had not talked to Darius on the phone. Darius's phone had not made any connection after midnight on the date in question. Why did you tell the 911 operator that you heard things and they wouldn't call back and they wouldn't answer the phone?
Because the way that my sister called me, crying and frantic, I knew something was wrong. So I'm trying to just get somebody out there now, right now.
She made up what she said on the 911 call because it was the first thing that popped into her mind to get the police to their house.
It's not good to lie to 911, but I thought the jury would be able to understand.
I mean, understand, she's concerned. She has not heard from her brothers, but it did kind of make me think, is she really telling the truth? In the beginning, I thought the defense was doing a little better.
You never told the police it was Walter.
If the jury believes she's coming in now changing her story, then we're in trouble.
We thought at the beginning that it could have been her.
I needed to convince the jury the only choice we had was to call the ex-girlfriend to testify. What was your hope with your relationship with Darius at that point, early morning hours of the 28th?
We were talking about us and fixing our relationship.
I really felt sad for her. She has children with him. And when she could prove where she was at, that's when I started thinking no, it was not her. I don't think she had anything to do with it. But if someone else was involved, who was that person? They have to prove who actually committed the crime.
At this point in the trial, we still had a circumstantial case.
I was very nervous about the defense attorney casting a doubt. And that's when I really had to go into my faith and say, but God, you God. You God all by yourself.
The next witness is Lindsay Sikorsky. I needed to present direct evidence that he actually pulled the trigger. So there was a lot riding on the ballistics expert. Did you perform that microscopic examination on each one of these shell casings or just some of them?
On all of them.
We would not be able to convict Walter without comparing the shell casings found in his car to the shell casings that were located at the scene.
There is a very small hairline. If you can see this little black line that's running from the top to the bottom here, and you'll see this is the firing pin impression. So what
Her testimony made a lot of sense to show how the shell casings match up.
Were there any casings that you thought didn't come from the same gun?
No, they were all fired from the same firearm.
That puts the gun in Walter's hand.
But the defense tried to muddy the waters.
There are no universal standards in what you're doing.
It is a subjective science.
And I think he was trying to make us understand she could be wrong. We're human, we make mistakes.
If the defense can convince the jury that this is just the examiner's opinion and they shouldn't listen to it, then we lose that ballistics evidence.
And without it, there would be no conviction.
"3 years after the arrest of Walter Hill,
What do you feel right now?
Nothing. I really don't feel it.
I think that was about the only honest part in this interview besides his name. If you brought somebody into an interview room and they didn't do something, they would be legitimately pissed. He was just extremely calm.
Feel bad about what happened? I feel bad when it happened.
But you don't feel bad now? Are you that cold, man?
He just has a type of aura around him that's no emotion, no remorse.
Come on, man. You owe it to his family to at least explain it. Dude, he was your best friend.
I wanted to impress on the jury that even though there was no motive, Walters still killed them.
In that interview, he revealed that he was a cold person that was capable of committing these murders. The closing argument is probably the most important part of the trial.
All the police believe it's Walter. And the problem is, they then shut down the investigation. And instead of investigating a massacre, they investigate Walter.
The defense argued that there's reasonable doubt. We didn't have a good, believable reason why Walter would want to go in and do this terrible thing.
Do any of you know? I don't. But I can't find a motive in this case.
Fortunately, we had his cell tower locations. So let's talk about what Walter was doing that night. So he has a phone call around the time that he leaves the night scene. For the next 2 hours, Walter's driving all over the place. He's just driving.
During that time when he was driving around, I think he probably just had a lot just going on in his head.
This is someone that was in a bad place. He is at a crisis point where he's going to do something terrible. By this point, he's closed down on Oxford.
The street where Darius and CJ lived.
The cell phone evidence that placed his phone in the area was very strong. From this point on, he is a man on a mission. There is no more confusion. There is no more doubt.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am now going to read the jury charges, the law that applies to this case.
So at this point, the jury will begin their deliberations, and hopefully things will go quickly. Waiting for a verdict to come back, tensions are always high.
The risk was huge because all it needed was one juror to feel different. I did not want a hung juror. I did not want to go through this again.
It's my understanding you have a verdict. Mr. Hill, will you please rise? Count 1, malice murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Count 2, malice murder.
Walter was found guilty on all counts in the indictment.
The prosecutors did a really great job of proving that he was there at that time. When the judge read the verdict, I was looking right at Walter Hill. He was still the same. There was no emotions at all.
All right, this is Miss Tyree Brown.
We're here to support the state so that another family don't have to be going through this, believing that they're amongst a friend, and then find out it's a wolf.
When I'm at my lowest, I call for my grandkids to come over. They bring their innocence and they bring their love, and it strengthens me.
Give him a hug.
with Darius' ex-girlfriend. It made me look at my own flaws and my own self. Once I got in her presence, I knew that she had nothing to do with this.
Hey!
And I am very thankful for the new relationship that she and I have now. With the grandchildren, we do Sunday school whenever they're here. Hey, y'all. Today, we gonna talk about walking in love. You walk in love by not fighting, by not hating. Love is just so much easier to walk in. It's light. You hate, that means you gotta be all puffed up. You gotta remember it. That's too heavy. Naya, you had to walk in love when it was time to do your victim statement, right? Because of what Walter did to our family.
I had to forgive him because even though it's not right, I still can't have hate in my heart. I told him I wasn't mad, but I wouldn't have my dad walk me down the aisle or walk me to prom or see me have kids. Things that a dad's supposed to help you with.
You still feel the emptiness of CJ and Darius not being here. But looking into the eyes of Darius's children, he's here. And CJ's praise and worship doesn't stop. It lives on through his nieces and nephews. Our future is bright. As long as they know how to walk in love, they'll be okay.
The phone rang at 2:13 in the morning. For nearly 40 years, that sound would become the moment investigators, reporters, and an entire Missouri community would remember as the instant of forgotten nightmare came back to life. A retired detective was asleep when the call came through. The voice on the other end was nervous, hesitant, almost afraid of what the words might reveal. Detective, I think I know who did it. For decades of silence, for decades of unanswered questions, for decades of family waiting for a truth that seemed buried forever. But one phone call was about to reopen a case everyone thought had disappeared into history. A cold case that haunted Missouri. A mystery that began on a quiet autumn night in 1983. A young woman vanished without warning, and behind her disappearance was a trail of strange evidence, missing memories, and one hidden secret that investigators would spend decades trying to uncover. Her name was Laura Bennett. She was 26 years old, a daughter, a sister, a friend. To everyone who knew her, Laura was the kind of person who made ordinary moments feel important. She worked at a small accounting office outside Jefferson County, Missouri. She volunteered at a local animal shelter on weekends. She remembered birthdays. She checked on neighbors. She was known for leaving handwritten notes instead of sending quick messages. People describe her as someone who noticed everything. But on October 17th, 1983, Laura noticed something that may have changed her life forever, because that night she disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of Laura came just after 8:40 p.m. A customer at a nearby gas station remembered seeing her standing beside her blue sedan. The weather was cold. A light fog covered the road. The parking lot lights flickered above her as she appeared to be looking toward the highway. The witness remembered something unusual. Laura was not alone. A second vehicle was parked nearby, a dark-colored pickup truck. The witness could not remember the license plate, could not identify the driver, could only remember one detail. The person inside the truck never got out. For investigators, that single memory would become one of the first pieces of a puzzle that will remain incomplete for decades. The next morning, Laura's car was discovered on an abandoned service road several miles away. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was still inside. Her wallet. Her keys. Her jacket. Everything was there. Except Laura. The scene immediately raised questions. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No broken windows. No damaged vehicle. No clear evidence explaining why a young woman would leave her car behind in the middle of nowhere. But detectives noticed something strange. On the passenger side window was a small fingerprint. A single print left behind in a place where it should not have been. At the time, forensic technology was limited. Investigators photographed the print. collected what evidence they could, but the fingerprint did not lead to a suspect. There was no match, no name, no answer. Just a mark left behind by someone who seemed to vanish along with Laura. The investigation exploded across the county. Police interviewed friends, family members, co-workers, neighbors. Everyone had theories. Some believed Laura left voluntarily. Others believed she had met someone she trusted, but her family rejected the idea that she would simply disappear. Laura had plans. She had responsibilities. She had a future she was building, and she had never gone more than a few hours without contacting someone close to her. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. Search teams walked through fields and wooded areas. Volunteers searched abandoned buildings. Police followed hundreds of tips, but every possible lead collapsed. Every promising clue disappeared. The case slowly moved from active investigation to an unsolved file, then eventually into a storage room, a cardboard box, a case number, a name written on the side, Laura Bennett. For years, that box remained untouched. The world changed around it. Technology advanced. New forensic methods emerged. But Laura's case remained frozen in 1983, until the day investigators reopened old evidence and discovered something they had missed: the fingerprint. The same fingerprint collected nearly 40 years earlier. The one that had once meant nothing. The one that had been sitting inside an evidence file while the person responsible lived an ordinary life. Because by the late 2010s, fingerprint databases had expanded. Old evidence could finally be compared against millions of records. And when forensic analysts entered that forgotten print into the system, they found something unexpected: a possible match, a name, a connection, a person investigators had never seriously considered in 1983. But before they could move forward, they needed more. They needed confirmation. They needed to know whether the fingerprint truly belonged to the person connected to Laura's disappearance. And then came the phone call. The call that changed everything. The caller was not a detective, not a journalist, not a witness from 1983. It was someone who had carried a secret for decades. Someone who believed the truth had been hidden long enough. Someone who knew what happened on that cold Missouri night. When investigators listened to the details, they realized the case they thought they understood was completely different. The disappearance of Laura Bennett was not a random mystery. It was a story built around one forgotten moment, one decision, one person who stayed silent, and one phone call that finally broke the silence. For the first time in nearly 40 years, detectives had a path forward, but that path would lead them into a disturbing discovery. Because the person connected to Laura's disappearance had never left Missouri, had never escaped, had been living among the same communities that had spent decades searching for answers. And as investigators began digging deeper, they uncovered a timeline filled with contradictions, hidden relationships, and a secret that had survived longer than anyone imagined. The cold case was no longer cold. The evidence was speaking again. And this time, it was pointing towards someone who had been there from the beginning. The investigation that had been frozen for decades suddenly moved at a speed no one expected. For years, Laura Bennett's disappearance had been a question with no answer. A photograph on a missing person poster. A name in an old newspaper article. A file buried beneath thousands of other forgotten cases. But after the fingerprint discovery and the mysterious phone call, detectives were no longer searching through darkness. They finally had a direction. And that direction led them back to the night everything changed. October 17, 1983. The night Laura vanished. Investigators returned to the original case files. They reopened every interview, every photograph, every handwritten note, every piece of evidence collected from the abandoned service road where Laura's car had been found. What they discovered shocked them. The first investigation had focused heavily on Laura's personal life, her relationships, her work, her daily routine. But almost nobody had looked closely enough at the people passing through the area that night. The focus had been on Laura. Now, almost 40 years later, detectives shifted their attention to everyone around her. And one name appeared again, a name that had been mentioned in the original files, but never investigated deeply. Michael Carter. In 1983, Carter was 29 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop near the highway where Laura was last seen. He was known around town. Quiet. Reliable. The type of person neighbors described as someone who keeps to himself. During the original investigation, Carter had spoken with police. He told detectives he remembered seeing Laura's car near the gas station. He admitted he was in the area that night, but he claimed he left before anything happened. At the time, investigators had no reason to challenge his statement. There was no physical evidence connecting him to Laura, no witness placing him beside her vehicle, no reason to believe his story was anything but the truth. But decades later, that changed. The fingerprint from Laura's car matched evidence connected to Michael Carter. And suddenly, a forgotten interview from 1983 looked very different. Detectives pulled the old recording. They listened carefully. They noticed things they had missed before. Small pauses, unusual wording, moments where Carter seemed to choose his answers carefully. Back then, those details meant nothing. Now, they felt like warning signs. The investigators needed to know where Carter had been on the night Laura disappeared. So they started rebuilding his timeline. And the deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. Carter had told police he went directly home after leaving the gas station area. But phone records from the time showed something different. A friend who lived nearby remembered seeing Carter's truck parked close to the abandoned service road, where Laura's vehicle was discovered. At first, the witness was uncertain. After 40 years, memories could fade. Details could become distorted. But when investigators showed the witness photographs of Carter's old truck, the reaction was immediate. That's the one. The words changed everything, because the truck matched the description from the gas station witness. The same dark-colored pickup. The same vehicle seen near Laura's car. The same vehicle that had disappeared from the investigation decades earlier. But detectives still needed answers. They needed to know why Carter would have been near Laura that night. And that question led them to another discovery. A hidden connection. A connection that had never been mentioned during the original investigation. Laura and Michael Carter knew each other. Not closely, not publicly, but they had crossed paths. Several times. According to old records, Laura had taken her car to Carter's repair shop months before her disappearance. She had complained about engine problems. Carter had worked on the vehicle. He had access to the same car where the mysterious fingerprint was later found. At the time, investigators never considered it suspicious. Mechanics touched hundreds of vehicles. Fingerprints were everywhere. But now, that innocent explanation began to fall apart, because the fingerprint was not found in an obvious place. It was found on the passenger side window, a location investigators believed suggested someone had been sitting inside the vehicle, someone who was not supposed to be there, someone who may have entered after Laura was gone. The evidence that once seemed meaningless was suddenly becoming the center of the entire case. But the biggest breakthrough came from the phone call. The caller who reopened the investigation was identified as Daniel Reeves, a former friend of Michael Carter. Reeves had lived with a secret for nearly 4 decades. He had been 19 years old in 1983, a young man who made one decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He told detectives that shortly after Laura disappeared, Carter showed up at his home late at night, panicked, shaking. Different from the calm mechanic, everyone knew. Reeves said Carter confessed that something terrible had happened, but he never gave the full story. He never went to police. He never told Laura's family. He stayed silent. And as the years passed, that silence became heavier. Reeves explained that he spent decades convincing himself he did not know enough, that maybe he misunderstood, that maybe speaking up would destroy innocent people. But as he grew older, the weight of what he knew became impossible to ignore, especially after seeing Laura's family continue searching for answers. A missing person case that never ended. A family that never got closure. A woman whose name remained on a file because someone chose silence. That was why he made the call. Not because he wanted attention, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he believed Laura deserved the truth. Investigators recorded every word, every detail, every memory. Then they compared Reeves' story with the old evidence, and the timeline began to align. The abandoned service road, the dark pickup truck, the fingerprint, the connection between Laura and Carter, the decades-old secret. Piece by piece, the impossible case started becoming a real investigation again. But detectives knew they had to move carefully. A confession from a witness was not enough. A fingerprint was powerful, but they needed a complete picture. They needed to know what happened after Laura disappeared, where she went, who was responsible, and why someone had spent 40 years hiding the truth. So investigators began following a trail that had been waiting since 1983. They searched old property records. They examined archive photographs. They interviewed people who had never been questioned before. And eventually, they discovered something buried beneath years of forgotten information. A location. A place connected to Michael Carter. A place where investigators believed Laura's final moments may have occurred. When they arrived, they found something that had remained untouched for decades. Something hidden in plain sight. Something that would transform the case from a disappearance investigation into a shocking criminal discovery. Because after 40 years of silence, the ground was finally ready to reveal what happened. The search that followed changed everything. For decades, investigators have been chasing a shadow, a missing woman, a forgotten vehicle, a fingerprint with no name attached, a case that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But now, for the first time since 1983, detectives had a location, a place connected to a man whose name had appeared in the investigation again and again, Michael Carter, the old mechanic who had once been considered just another witness, the man who claimed he knew nothing, the man whose fingerprint had waited nearly 40 years to tell a different story. Investigators arrived at the property early in the morning. It was an abandoned piece of land outside Jefferson County, a place most people had forgotten existed. The area looked different from old photographs. Trees had grown taller. The roads had changed. Buildings had collapsed. Time had covered the landscape like a blanket. But detectives were not searching for what was visible. They were searching for what had been hidden. Because one detail from Daniel Reeves' phone call stood out. A sentence he repeated several times. Something Carter had said that night in 1983. He told me nobody would ever find her. Those words had stayed with Reeves for decades. At the time, he convinced himself it was impossible. A frightened person saying something meaningless. A person trying to scare him. But now, standing on the abandoned property, detectives wondered if those words had been a confession. The search began. Forensic teams moved slowly. Every inch mattered. Every piece of dirt. Every broken object. Every forgotten corner. The investigation was no longer just about finding evidence. It was about uncovering a truth buried for nearly 40 years. Then, beneath an old structure near the back of the property, investigators found something unusual. A small object, rust-covered, weather-damaged, but recognizable. It was connected to Laura Bennett. The discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Because until that moment, detectives had a suspect. They had a possible motive. They had a witness statement. But they did not have proof that Laura had ever been there. Now they did. The case that had been frozen for decades suddenly became active again. News spread quickly. A cold case reopened. A missing woman finally connected to a location. A suspect who had lived freely while investigators searched for answers. The community reacted with shock. Many residents remembered Laura. They remembered the posters, the searches, the uncertainty. Some had spent years wondering if she was still alive somewhere. Others had accepted the painful possibility that she was gone. But nobody expected the truth to return after so long. Especially not this way. Especially not with fingerprint, a phone call, and a forgotten piece of evidence that had survived longer than anyone involved. As investigators continued examining the property, They began rebuilding Michael Carter's life after 1983, and what they discovered created even more questions. After Laura disappeared, Carter did not leave town. He did not change his name. He did not run. Instead, he continued living an ordinary life. He worked. He paid bills. He built relationships. He became someone neighbors trusted. Some people who knew him decades later describe him as friendly, helpful, a normal person. And that was what disturbed investigators the most. The idea that someone connected to such a terrible mystery could continue living among everyone as if nothing had happened. The investigation also revealed another disturbing detail. Carter had changed his story over the years. Small changes, almost invisible. But important. In 1983, he told police he had never spoken with Laura outside of the repair shop. Years later, when questioned again, he admitted they had talked several times. He said he remembered her visiting the shop. He remembered her car. He remembered details he had previously claimed to forget. Detectives knew memory could change over time. They knew people forgot things, but they also knew something else. People sometimes reveal information when they realize they cannot hide forever. The pressure on Carter increased. Investigators requested another interview. This time, they approached him differently. They did not accuse him. They did not reveal everything they knew. They simply asked questions. Where were you that night? Why was your fingerprint on Laura's vehicle? Why did a witness remember your truck near the location where her car was found? Why did Daniel Reeves say you confessed? Carter remained calm. At first, he denied everything. He said Reeves was lying. He said the fingerprint meant nothing. He said investigators were trying to blame him because they had no other suspects. But detectives noticed something. A reaction. A moment of hesitation. A small change in his voice. The same thing they had heard when they reviewed the old interview from 1983. A person carefully choosing words. A person trying not to reveal too much. The interview lasted hours, but it ended without an admission. Carter walked away. The case remained open, and investigators knew they needed more. They needed the final piece. The one piece that would connect the evidence together permanently. Then another discovery surfaced. A forgotten photograph. A photograph hidden inside an old storage box belonging to someone who had worked near Carter's repair shop. The image was not clear. It was old, faded. But detectives immediately noticed something in the background. A vehicle. A dark pickup truck, parked near the same area where Laura's car had been found. The date on the photograph? October 17th, 1983, the night Laura disappeared. Suddenly, the investigation took another shocking turn, because the photograph suggested something impossible. Someone had captured a moment from that night, a moment nobody knew existed. And somewhere inside that image was a clue investigators had been searching for since the beginning. The question was no longer just what happened to Laura Bennett. The question was who had been watching, who had been hiding the truth, and why had someone waited almost 40 years before making the call that brought the case back from the dead. As detectives examined the photograph frame by frame, they realized a mystery was deeper than they imagined. The cold case was cracking, but the truth waiting underneath was darker than anyone expected. The photograph became the center of the investigation. A single image, a forgotten piece of paper trapped inside an old storage box. For nearly 40 years it had sat untouched. Nobody knew it existed. Nobody knew what it showed. Nobody knew that hidden inside the faded colors of a photograph from October 17th, 1983, was a clue that could change everything. Investigators studied the image under forensic lighting. They enlarged every corner, every shadow, every reflection. And then they saw it. The dark pickup truck. The same type of vehicle described by the witness who saw Laura Bennett at the gas station. The same vehicle connected to Michael Carter. The same vehicle that had never been fully investigated. But the photograph revealed something even more disturbing. There was someone standing near the truck, a person in the distance. The image quality was poor. The face was impossible to identify. But the clothing, the height, the body shape. Everything appeared consistent with Carter. For investigators, it was not enough to prove guilt, but it was enough to prove one thing. Michael Carter had lied. The man who claimed he had nothing to do with Laura's disappearance had been closer to the scene than he admitted. And suddenly, every unanswered question from 1983 returned. Why was Carter there? Why did he deny knowing Laura well? Why did his fingerprint appear inside her car? Why did he tell Daniel Reeves that nobody would ever find her? The case was no longer a mystery, without direction. It was becoming a timeline built from forgotten evidence, a timeline that pointed toward one terrible night. But investigators still face a problem. 40 years had passed. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some people connected to the case had died. Some evidence had been lost. And Michael Carter had spent decades building a life away from suspicion. He was not the same young mechanic from 1983. He was older, more careful, and he knew investigators were getting closer. That pressure became obvious when detectives began monitoring his movements. They noticed something unusual. Carter started changing his routine. He avoided certain places. He stopped visiting the area where his repair shop once stood. He became less social. Neighbors noticed. People who had known him for years began asking questions. The rumors spread. The quiet mechanic from the past, the missing woman, the fingerprint, the old photograph. A community that had forgotten Laura's name suddenly remembered everything. The story returned to the headlines. Cold case breakthrough. Decades-old mystery reopened. One fingerprint changes everything. The public reaction was immediate. Some people were angry. Others were shocked. Many wonder how the truth could have remained hidden for so long. Laura's family had spent decades waiting. Her mother had kept Laura's bedroom untouched. Her photographs remained on the wall. Her clothes remained stored away. A life frozen in time. For years, the family had received no answers, only silence, only questions. Now, that silence was finally beginning to break. But investigators knew the family deserved more than suspicion. They deserved proof. So the forensic examination continued. The old fingerprint became the foundation of the case. Experts compared it again, then again. Using modern technology, they confirmed what investigators already suspected. The print belonged to Michael Carter. The discovery was explosive because it placed Carter inside Laura's vehicle after years of denial. But detectives still needed to understand the sequence of events. A fingerprint could show presence. It could show contact. But it could not explain what happened. It could not tell them why Laura disappeared. It could not tell them where she went. For that, they needed Carter's own words. And investigators believed they were close to getting them. Because during the second interview, Carter made a mistake. A small mistake. A sentence that changed the entire conversation. When detectives asked about the abandoned service road, Carter suddenly mentioned a detail they had never told him. He described the location, the exact area, the position of Laura's car, the direction the vehicle was facing. Then he stopped. The room went silent. The detectives looked at each other because there was one problem. That information had never been released publicly, not in newspapers, not in reports. Not anywhere. Only investigators knew those details, and Michael Carter knew them. For the first time, detectives saw something they had been waiting decades to find. A crack in the story. A moment where the truth pushed through. Carter immediately tried to explain. He said he had heard it from someone else. He said people talked. He said rumors spread. But investigators knew rumors did not explain everything. Not the fingerprint. Not the truck. Not the photograph. Not the secret phone call. The evidence was closing around him. Yet Carter continued denying involvement. He refused to admit anything. He refused to explain. And then, just when investigators believed the case was reaching its final stage, another unexpected development appeared. A second witness came forward. Someone who had never spoken publicly. someone who had kept a memory buried for decades. The witness claimed they saw Michael Carter's truck near Laura's car on the night she vanished. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was what happened afterward. The witness said Carter was not alone. There was another person with him. Someone who had never appeared in the original investigation. Someone whose name had been missing from every file. A person who may have known the truth from the beginning. Suddenly, the case changed again, because investigators had spent months focusing on one suspect. But now, they had to consider another possibility. Michael Carter may not have acted alone. The cold case that seemed close to being solved had opened a deeper mystery. Another name. Another secret. Another person who had spent decades living with what happened that night. And as detectives began searching through old records, they uncovered a connection between Carter and the mysterious second person. A connection that could finally reveal why Laura Bennett disappeared. Because after 40 years of silence, the truth was no longer buried. It was beginning to surface. The discovery of another name inside the investigation changed the entire direction of the case. For nearly 40 years, every question surrounding Laura Bennett's disappearance had pointed toward one person, Michael Carter. The fingerprint, the truck, the photograph, the hidden confession, the strange details he somehow knew. Every road investigators followed seemed to lead back to him. But now, for the first time, detectives had to consider something far more disturbing. What if Michael Carter was not the only person who knew what happened that night? What if someone else had been there? Someone who had watched the truth disappear. Someone who had carried the secret for decades. The second name belonged to Thomas Reed. In 1983, Reed was 24 years old. He worked temporary jobs around Jefferson County, mostly construction, small repairs, odd work. He was not someone investigators remembered from the original case. His name was never highlighted, never placed on a suspect list, never mentioned in newspaper reports. Because back then, nobody knew he was connected. But decades later, his name appeared inside a forgotten document, a handwritten note, buried inside old evidence files. The note was written by an investigator who had interviewed dozens of people during the first weeks after Laura disappeared. It contained only a few words. Possible witness. Never followed up. That sentence shocked investigators. A possible witness. Never followed up. How could someone connected to the case have been overlooked for 40 years? Detectives immediately searched for Thomas Reed, and what they found was unexpected. Reed was still alive, still living in Missouri, still carrying a memory from October 17, 1983, when investigators contacted him. He initially refused to speak. He said he had nothing to do with Laura Bennett. He said he did not want to reopen old pain. But detectives knew something. People who truly have nothing to hide usually do not spend decades avoiding a conversation. Eventually, Reed agreed to meet. The interview room was quiet. A camera recorded every movement, every expression, every pause. Detectives placed photographs from 1983 on the table. Laura's vehicle, the gas station, the abandoned road, the old repair shop. Reed stared at the images for a long time. Then he said something that immediately changed the atmosphere. I knew she was never going to come home. The detectives froze, because those were not the words of someone hearing about the case for the first time. Those were the words of someone who already knew the ending. They asked him what he meant. At first, Reed avoided the question. He looked down. He changed his story. He said he only heard rumors. He said people in town talked. He said everyone suspected something bad happened, but investigators pushed harder. They asked about Michael Carter. And that was when Reed became visibly uncomfortable, because Carter's name was the one thing he did not want to discuss. Eventually, after hours of questioning, Reed revealed the first piece of information. He admitted he saw Carter on the night Laura disappeared. Not at the gas station, not near the repair shop, but on the road where Laura's car was later discovered. That detail had never been made public. Investigators asked him why he never came forward. His answer was simple: fear. Reed said Michael Carter had a reputation in the area, not for violence, not for criminal behavior, but for intimidation. He was the kind of person who could make people uncomfortable without saying much, a person who could make a warning feel like a threat. Reed claimed that after Laura disappeared, Carter told him to forget what he saw. He said Carter told him that some things were better left alone. At the time, Reed was young. He was scared. And he made the decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He stayed silent. But investigators needed more than fear. They needed facts. They needed to know exactly what Reed saw. So they asked him to describe that night, and his memory created a timeline that matched the evidence. Reed said he was driving home late that evening when he saw two vehicles near the abandoned service road, Laura's blue sedan and Carter's dark pickup truck. He remembered thinking it was strange because the road was rarely used. There was no reason for anyone to stop there. Then he saw movement. Two people outside the vehicles. One appeared to be Laura. The other was a man. Reed could not see everything clearly, but he remembered one thing: the argument. He said the two people were not talking calmly. They were standing close. Their body language was tense. Laura appeared upset. Then Reed saw Carter move toward her vehicle. Seconds later, Reed drove away. He told himself he should not get involved. He told himself it was probably nothing. But the next morning, when he heard Laura was missing, everything changed. The memory returned. The road, the vehicles, the argument, the silence, and the fear. For 40 years, Reed carried that moment alone. But now, his story gave investigators something they had never had before: a possible explanation of what happened in the final minutes before Laura disappeared. However, detectives noticed something strange. Reed was still hiding something. They could feel it. The interview was not over. There was another piece, another detail, something he had not said. When investigators asked why he waited until now to speak, Reed hesitated. Then he revealed the real reason. It was not guilt. It was not pressure. It was another phone call. A phone call he received weeks before contacting detectives. A call from someone connected to Michael Carter. Someone who told Reed that the truth was about to come out. Someone who knew the investigation had reopened. Someone who was afraid. That person's identity shocked investigators, because it was someone they never expected. A person who had been close to Carter for decades. A person who may have known everything. The case was expanding again. The fingerprint had opened the door. The photograph had widened the path. The witness had exposed the hidden timeline. And now, another voice was entering the story. A voice that could finally explain what happened on that cold October night. But before detectives could reach that person, something happened. Something that turned the investigation from a search for answers into a race against time. Because after 40 years of silence, someone was suddenly desperate to stop the truth from being discovered, and investigators realized one terrifying possibility. The people who knew what happened to Laura Bennett had never forgotten. They had only been waiting. The investigation had entered a new phase. For decades, Laura Bennett's disappearance had been a mystery trapped in the past. A cold case locked inside old files. A photograph fading inside a forgotten box. A fingerprint waiting for technology to finally reveal its secret. But now, the past was no longer silent. The people connected to that night were speaking. And every new answer created an even bigger question, because detectives were beginning to understand something terrifying. The truth had not disappeared. It had been hidden. And someone had worked very hard to keep it hidden. After Thomas Reed's interview, investigators immediately returned to the timeline of October 17, 1983. They reviewed every known movement, every phone record, every witness statement, every detail that had been ignored during the original investigation. The picture they built was disturbing. Laura Bennett had not vanished randomly. She had not simply walked away. Something happened during a short window of time, a window of less than 1 hour, a period between the last confirmed sighting at the gas station and the moment her abandoned vehicle was discovered. Less than 60 minutes. That was all it took for a young woman to disappear forever, and for someone to create a mystery that would last nearly 4 decades. Detectives focus again on Michael Carter. They knew the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore, but they also knew something else. A person could survive suspicion. A person could survive rumors. A person could survive decades of questions, but they could not survive the truth. And investigators believed the truth was finally closing in. The next step was to examine Carter's life after 1983. They wanted to know if there were other moments where he had revealed information he should not have known. They searched old interviews. They contacted former co-workers. They spoke with neighbors. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. Several people remembered Carter acting strangely after Laura disappeared. Not openly suspicious. Not obviously guilty. But different. One former co-worker remembered Carter arriving at the repair shop the morning after Laura vanished. He said Carter looked exhausted. He said Carter seemed distracted. When someone mentioned the missing woman on the news, Carter reacted immediately. The co-worker remembered something unusual. Carter already knew details that had not yet been released. At the time, nobody questioned it. People assumed he heard rumors. People assumed someone told him. But decades later, that memory became another piece of the puzzle. Investigators also discovered that Carter left his repair shop earlier than usual on the night Laura disappeared. His old employment records showed he was scheduled to work late, but he was gone before closing. No explanation. No reason. Just another unanswered question. The case continued expanding. And then came another breakthrough. A hidden audio recording. During the original investigation, detectives had recorded interviews on cassette tapes. Thousands of hours of conversations. Most had never been reviewed again. Technology had changed. Digital systems could now analyze old recordings. And when forensic specialists examined those tapes, they discovered something unexpected. A conversation between Michael Carter and investigators from 1983. A conversation that revealed a detail nobody noticed at the time. Detectives listened carefully. Carter was asked whether he had seen Laura's vehicle after leaving the gas station area. His answer was immediate. No. Simple. Clear. But moments later, while explaining his timeline, Carter mentioned something impossible. He described the position of Laura's car, the angle, the location, the open driver's door, details he claimed he never saw. The original investigators had not noticed. They were focused on finding Laura. They were focused on the bigger questions. But 40 years later, listening with fresh eyes and modern techniques, detectives heard something different. A contradiction. A mistake. A moment where Carter accidentally revealed knowledge he should not have had. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. But still, Carter refused to confess. He hired legal representation. He stopped speaking with investigators. He insisted he was innocent. He claimed everyone was trying to turn him into a villain because the real person responsible had never been found. And then, unexpectedly, another person contacted police. A woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was in her early 20s in 1983. At the time of Laura's disappearance, she had worked at the same repair shop as Carter. She had never been interviewed during the original investigation because nobody knew she had information. But now, after hearing the case had reopened, she decided she could no longer remain silent. Her story stunned detectives. Sarah said that shortly after Laura disappeared, Carter asked her to clean the interior of his truck. She remembered finding it strange. Carter was usually protective of his vehicle. He rarely allowed anyone else to touch it. But that morning, he was different. He was nervous. He was impatient. He kept looking toward the road. Sarah said she noticed something inside the truck, a small piece of blue fabric. At the time, she thought nothing of it. But years later, when she saw photographs of Laura's clothing, she recognized the color, the same shade, the same material, a detail that had stayed buried in her memory for decades. Investigators knew they had to verify everything. Memory was powerful, but memory could also change. So they examined every possible connection. They compared old photographs. They reviewed evidence logs. They searched for anything related to Carter's truck. And then they found something that sent the investigation in a new direction. A vehicle record. A repair document. A piece of information showing that Carter had made changes to his truck shortly after Laura disappeared. A repair that had never been questioned. A repair that suddenly looked suspicious. The investigation was no longer about whether Carter knew something. It was about what he had done. But as detectives prepared to confront Carter with the new evidence, another unexpected event occurred. Someone attempted to contact Sarah Mitchell. Someone who wanted to know exactly what she told police. Someone who wanted her to stay quiet. When investigators learned about the contact, they realized the case was not just a historical investigation anymore. The danger was happening in the present. Someone was still protecting the secret. Someone was still afraid of what the truth would reveal. And that meant one thing. The person responsible for Laura Bennett's disappearance had spent 40 years believing the past was buried, but now the past had returned, and it was coming for them. The past was no longer buried. After 40 years of silence, the investigation into Laura Bennett's disappearance had become something much bigger than a forgotten missing person case. It was no longer only about what happened in 1983. It was about who had spent decades protecting the secret, who had lied, who had stayed quiet, and who was willing to do anything to keep the truth from coming out. The attempted contact with Sarah Mitchell changed the atmosphere inside the investigation. Until that moment, detectives believed they were chasing a person connected to the past. Now they realized something far more disturbing. Someone connected to Laura's disappearance was still watching, still paying attention, still afraid. The cold case was alive again, and someone knew it. Investigators immediately increased security around the remaining witnesses. Thomas Reed, Sarah Mitchell, anyone who had provided information, because after decades of waiting, the truth was finally moving. And when truth moves after 40 years, people who built their lives around a lie sometimes panic. Michael Carter was now under intense scrutiny. Every movement, every conversation, every connection. Detectives began examining the years after Laura vanished. They wanted to understand how Carter had lived with the weight of the case, how he had managed to continue his life while a family searched for answers. What they discovered was unsettling. Carter had remained remarkably consistent. He avoided attention. He rarely spoke about the past. He never participated in public searches. He never contacted Laura's family. He never offered theories. To some people, that behavior seemed normal. A quiet person staying out of a painful situation. But investigators saw something else. They saw someone who knew exactly how much information to reveal and how much to hide. The deeper detectives looked, the more contradictions appeared. One former neighbor remembered Carter returning home late on the night Laura disappeared. Another remembered seeing his truck parked outside his house the following morning. But when investigators compared those memories with Carter's original statement, they found a problem. Carter claimed he was home all night. He claimed he never left. The evidence suggested otherwise. The investigation moved into the final stages of rebuilding the timeline, and then detectives discovered something hidden inside old property records. A piece of information that connected Michael Carter to the location where Laura's belongings had been found. Years earlier, Carter had owned a small piece of land near the abandoned service road. He had sold it shortly after Laura disappeared. At the time, nobody considered it important. But now, investigators had to ask the obvious question. Why sell the property so quickly? Why leave the area where one of the biggest mysteries in Missouri history began? Carter claimed it was coincidence, financial problems, personal reasons. Nothing more. But detectives had heard those explanations before. Every suspect had a reason. Every suspect had a story. The challenge was finding the moment where the story broke. And for Carter, that moment came during a forensic examination of his old truck records. The dark pickup truck. The vehicle that had appeared in witness statements. The vehicle connected to the photograph, the vehicle that had followed the case for decades. Investigators discovered that Carter had replaced several interior parts shortly after Laura disappeared. Seats, floor coverings, door panels. At the time, those repairs seemed ordinary. Vehicles needed maintenance. Old trucks broke down. But investigators noticed something. The repairs happened immediately after October 17, 1983. Not months later. Not years later. Days later. The timing was impossible to ignore. Forensic specialists searched through remaining records. They found that one replaced item had been stored. A small section of material from the original interior. A piece nobody realized could matter. But now, after modern testing, investigators believed it might hold answers. The item was sent for examination. The waiting period was intense, because after 40 years, technology had finally reached the evidence, the same way it had with the fingerprint, the same way it had with the old photograph, the same way it had with every forgotten piece of Laura Bennett's story. Days passed, then weeks, and finally, the results arrived. The analysis revealed something unexpected, a trace connection, a biological indicator, a discovery that forced investigators to return to the beginning of the case, because suddenly, the evidence suggested Laura had not disappeared from the roadside. She had been somewhere else, somewhere connected to Michael Carter, somewhere that had been hidden for decades. The investigators knew they were close, but there was still one major problem. They needed to prove intent. They needed to prove what happened. They needed the final piece that connected the evidence, the witnesses, and the timeline. And that final piece came from an unexpected source. A journal. Not Laura's. Not Carter's. Someone else's. A private journal written by a person who had spent years carrying a secret. Inside were dates, names, and one entry from October 18, 1983, the day after Laura disappeared. The words written there were short, but they changed the entire investigation because they suggested someone knew the truth before anyone else. Someone who was never considered a suspect. Someone who had been standing close to the case from the very beginning. Investigators now faced a terrifying possibility. Michael Carter may have been hiding something, but he may not have been the only one. The mystery that began with one missing woman had grown into a web of secrets, and every secret led back to the same night. October 17, 1983, the night Laura Bennett disappeared. The night a community lost someone they loved. The night someone decided silence was safer than the truth. But silence had a limit. And after 40 years, that limit had finally been reached. The discovery of the journal changed the investigation forever. For decades, detectives believed they were searching for one hidden truth, one person responsible, one answer buried beneath years of silence. But the pages found inside that old journal suggested something much more complicated. The disappearance of Laura Bennett was not just a story about one person hiding a secret. It was a story about multiple people who knew something, people who saw pieces of the truth, people who chose silence, and people who believed time would protect them forever. But time had done the opposite. Time had preserved the evidence. Time had kept the memories alive. And now, every forgotten detail was returning. The journal belonged to Emily Wallace. In 1983, she was a receptionist at the auto repair shop where Michael Carter worked. A person nobody considered important. A person whose name barely appeared in the original case file. She was not a suspect. She was not a witness. She was simply someone who worked nearby. But inside her private journal were entries that forced investigators to look at the case differently. The entry, dated October 18, 1983, was only a few sentences long. Emily wrote that she had seen Michael Carter arrive at the repair shop before sunrise. She wrote that he looked terrified. She wrote that he told her something had gone wrong. But the most shocking line was the final sentence. He said nobody could ever know what happened to Laura. Investigators read the words again and again because this was not a rumor. This was not a memory from 40 years later. This was a private record written at the exact moment the investigation began. a record created before anyone knew what the future would reveal. The journal gave detectives something they desperately needed, a direct connection between Carter and the aftermath of Laura's disappearance. But it also created another question. Why had Emily Wallace stayed silent? Why had she hidden this information for so long? When detectives located Emily, they discovered she had been living quietly in another state for decades. She agreed to speak, but before answering questions, she made one statement. I should have called in 1983. Those words carried the weight of 40 years. Emily explained that when Laura disappeared, fear controlled everything. People in the small community talked. Everyone had theories. Everyone had suspicions. But nobody wanted to accuse someone without proof. And Michael Carter had a way of making people uncomfortable. Emily said Carter never directly threatened her. He never told her to stay quiet. But she believed the message was clear. Some people did not need to threaten you. Their silence was enough. Their presence was enough. Their reputation was enough. Investigators asked Emily about the morning after Laura disappeared. She described Carter walking into the repair shop before opening. His clothes were dirty. His hands were shaking. He kept asking questions. Questions about what police knew. Questions about what witnesses had said. Questions about whether anyone had found Laura. At the time, Emily thought he was worried. Now, decades later, she wondered if he was checking how much investigators knew. The detectives compared Emily's statement with everything else. And once again, the timeline matched. Carter's behavior, the fingerprint, the truck, the photograph, the witness accounts, the journal. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were forming a picture. But investigators still needed to understand one thing. What was the connection between Michael Carter and Laura Bennett? Why would he become involved with her disappearance? The answer came from another forgotten detail. A detail hidden inside Laura's personal records. When investigators reviewed Laura's financial history, they discovered something unexpected. A few weeks before she vanished, Laura had reported problems with her vehicle. Nothing unusual. Thousands of people experienced car trouble, but the details mattered. Laura had returned to Carter's repair shop multiple times, and according to a friend, she had become uncomfortable during those visits. She had mentioned that Carter asked personal questions, questions that had nothing to do with her car, where she lived, who she spent time with, where she worked. At the time, Laura brushed it off. She assumed he was simply being friendly, but investigators now saw another possibility. Carter had been learning about her life, building familiarity, creating trust. The relationship between them may have been closer than anyone realized. And then came the discovery that shocked the entire investigation. A missing piece of evidence from 1983 had been found. A receipt, a repair invoice, a document showing Laura's final visit to Carter's shop. The date? October 17th, 1983, the same day she disappeared. According to the document, Laura had brought her car in that afternoon. The repair involved a small mechanical issue, nothing major. But the timing was critical, because it meant Carter had contact with Laura only hours before she vanished, and it meant he had access to her vehicle, the vehicle where his fingerprint was later found. The investigators now had a timeline. Laura visits Carter's shop. Laura is seen at the gas station. Carter's truck appears near her abandoned vehicle. Carter knows details he should not know. Carter's employee records show unusual behavior. Witnesses describe fear. And a journal reveals he spoke about Laura before anyone knew what happened. The case that once seemed impossible was becoming clear, but one final obstacle remained. Michael Carter. He still denied everything. He still refused to admit involvement. And investigators knew that without a confession or stronger physical evidence, the defense would challenge every piece of the case. They needed to know where Laura's final moments occurred. They needed to find the missing link. Then, while reviewing old property maps, detectives found something buried in a forgotten archive, a location connected to Carter, a place he had access to in 1983, a place that had never been searched, because nobody knew it mattered. a location just miles from where Laura's car was found, a place hidden behind years of overgrown vegetation, a place where investigators believe the final answers might still be waiting. The search began at sunrise, and within hours, forensic teams discovered something beneath the earth, something that proved Laura Bennett had been there, something that transformed a 40-year-old mystery into a criminal investigation, because after decades of questions, the truth was finally starting to appear, and this time nobody could hide it. The morning investigators returned to the forgotten property. The atmosphere felt different. For nearly 40 years, that piece of land had been nothing more than an empty space on an old map, a place people drove past without noticing, a place covered by weeds, broken branches, and the slow disappearance of time. But on that morning, everything changed, because detectives were no longer searching for possibilities. They were searching for the final moments of Laura Bennett's life. The property had been connected to Michael Carter for decades, a place he owned briefly after Laura disappeared, a place nobody thought to examine in 1983, a place hidden behind a simple explanation, a place that now stood at the center of the entire investigation. Forensic teams moved carefully across the ground. Every step was measured. Every discovery was documented. The investigators understood something important. 40 years had passed. Nature had changed the landscape. Weather had destroyed evidence. People had forgotten details. But some secrets do not disappear. They wait. They remain buried until someone knows where to look. And now, detectives believe they finally knew where to look. The search began around an old storage structure near the back of the property. The building had almost collapsed. The wooden walls were damaged. The roof had fallen in. Inside were broken tools, rusted equipment, and objects left behind by previous owners. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then a forensic technician noticed something. A small piece of material buried beneath layers of dirt. It was old, faded, almost impossible to recognize. But when investigators carefully removed it, they immediately stopped. The color, the texture, the condition, everything suggested it could be connected to Laura Bennett. The evidence was collected and sent for testing. But detectives did not stop there. They continued searching, because they believed this property contained more than one forgotten secret. Hours passed. Then another discovery was made. Near the edge of the property, investigators found an area where the ground appeared disturbed. Not recently, but decades earlier. A place where someone had once moved earth. A place where something had been hidden. The forensic team began examining the area. Slowly. Carefully. Patiently. Then came the discovery that changed the case forever. Human remains. The word spread through the investigation immediately. Human remains. After 40 years of uncertainty, after decades of waiting, after countless searches that ended with nothing, they had finally found evidence that could answer the question Laura's family had been asking since 1983. Where did Laura go? The area was secured. The investigation became a recovery operation. Every piece mattered. Every fragment. Every object. Every trace left behind. The discovery was emotional for everyone involved. For detectives who had spent years chasing answers. For witnesses who had carried guilt. And most of all, for Laura's family. The possibility of finally knowing what happened brought both relief and pain. Because answers can heal. But answers can also destroy the last remaining hope. For decades, Laura's family had lived with uncertainty. The unknown had become part of their lives. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every unidentified person found somewhere in the country. They wondered. They hoped. They waited. Now they were finally going to know, but investigators still had work to do. Finding remains was only the beginning. They needed confirmation. They needed identification. They needed to prove exactly what happened. And most importantly, they needed to connect Michael Carter to the evidence. The forensic examination began immediately. Modern technology was brought in, methods that did not exist in 1983. DNA testing, advanced material analysis, digital reconstruction. The same tools that had reopened the case were now being used to finish it. While the laboratory worked, detectives returned to Michael Carter. They wanted to know how he would react. Would he admit anything? Would he change his story? Would he finally tell the truth? When investigators contacted Carter, his response was unexpected. He did not ask about the evidence. He did not ask where the discovery was made. He did not ask if Laura had been found. Instead, he asked one question. How did you find that place? The detectives noticed immediately. A question. Not a denial. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Concern. Because Carter's reaction suggested something important. He understood exactly why that location mattered. Investigators scheduled another interview. This time, the approach was different. They no longer came with theories. They came with evidence. They placed photographs on the table. The property, the recovered items, the old fingerprint report, the journal entry, the witness statements, the timeline. One by one, they removed every possible escape route. Carter looked at the evidence. For the first time, detectives saw a change. The confidence was gone. The calm expression disappeared. The man who had spent decades controlling the story was losing control. But even then, he refused to confess. He said the evidence was misunderstood. He said people were remembering things incorrectly. He said the investigation was built on assumptions. Then detectives asked him one final question, a question that changed the room. If you knew Laura was on that property, why did you never tell anyone? Silence. A long silence. Carter looked down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he gave an answer that investigators would never forget. I was afraid. Those 3 words were the first crack. Not an admission. Not a confession. But the first moment where Carter acknowledged that he knew more than he had ever revealed. The investigation continued. And then the laboratory results returned. The evidence from the property was confirmed. The remains belonged to Laura Bennett. 40 years after she disappeared, her family finally had an answer. The missing woman from Missouri had been found. The cold case that haunted an entire community had finally moved toward justice. But detectives knew the case was not finished, because one question remained. Why? Why did Michael Carter do it? What happened between Laura's final sighting and the moment her life ended? And was he truly acting alone? The discovery of Laura's remains answered where she had been. But not everything, because buried alongside Laura was another mystery. A mystery involving the people who helped hide the truth, the people who knew, the people who stayed silent, and the person who made the phone call that started everything. As investigators prepared for the final stage of the case, they uncovered one more piece of evidence. A message. A forgotten recording. A final warning left behind by someone who knew the truth was coming. And the words inside that recording would reveal something nobody expected. Because Michael Carter was not the only person who had been hiding something for 40 years. The secret surrounding Laura Bennett's disappearance was even deeper than investigators imagined. And now, after decades of silence, everyone connected to that night was about to face the truth. The discovery of Laura Bennett's remains should have been the end of the mystery. For 40 years, her family had waited for that moment. The moment when the unanswered questions finally had answers. The moment when Laura's name would no longer appear on missing person posters. The moment when the world would finally know what happened on that cold October night in 1983. But instead of closing the case, the discovery opened another door. Because investigators had found Laura. They had found the location. They had uncovered the evidence. But they still needed the complete truth. They needed to know exactly how a young woman disappeared. They needed to know who was responsible. And they needed to understand why so many people remained silent for so long. The investigation had become more than a search for a missing person. It had become a search through decades of fears, secrets, and decisions that changed multiple lives forever. The forensic examination of the evidence continued for weeks. Every piece recovered from the property was analyzed. Every fragment was documented. Every connection was tested. The evidence created a timeline that became impossible to ignore. Laura had been at Michael Carter's repair shop on the afternoon of October 17, 1983. She had been seen near the gas station later that evening. Her vehicle had been discovered abandoned. Carter's fingerprint had been found inside the vehicle. His truck had been connected to the scene. Witnesses had placed him near the area. A journal entry had recorded his suspicious behavior the following morning, and now the property connected to him had revealed the final piece. The investigation that had once seemed impossible was becoming a story of one mistake after another, one lie after another, one secret after another. But detectives still faced one challenge. Michael Carter refused to break. He had survived suspicion for decades. He had learned how to answer questions without revealing anything. He knew how to appear calm, how to appear reasonable, how to make doubt work in his favor. But investigators understood something. People can control words. They can control stories. But they cannot control evidence. And the evidence was speaking louder than Carter ever could. The final interrogation began on a rainy morning. The room was quiet. A single table, 2 chairs, a recording device, and 40 years of unanswered questions sitting between them. Detectives did not rush. They did not accuse. They simply placed the evidence in front of him. First came the fingerprint, then the photograph, then the witness statements, then the journal, then the forensic results. One by one, piece by piece, the story that Carter had protected for decades began collapsing. At first, he continued denying everything. He said the fingerprint was meaningless. He said the witnesses were confused. He said the journal was exaggerated. He said the evidence had been interpreted incorrectly. But detectives noticed something. His explanations were changing. The same man who once claimed he barely knew Laura was now admitting they had conversations. The same man who claimed he never went near the abandoned road was now explaining why he might have been there. The same man who claimed he knew nothing about Laura's disappearance was now defending details only someone close to the situation would know. The walls were closing in. Then detectives mentioned Daniel Reeves, the old friend, the man who had carried the secret for decades. Carter's expression changed, just slightly, but enough. The detective saw it, because sometimes the smallest reaction reveals the biggest truth. They asked about the phone call. They asked why Reeves would suddenly come forward after 40 years. Carter stayed silent. Then investigators mentioned Sarah Mitchell. They mentioned Emily Wallace. They mentioned every person who had finally decided silence was no longer possible. And for the first time, Carter looked frustrated, not angry, not confused, frustrated, as if the past he believed was buried had suddenly returned to punish him. The interview continued for hours. Then came the moment detectives had been waiting for. They asked Carter about October 17, 1983. Not generally. Not about rumors. Not about evidence. They asked about Laura. What happened when she came to your shop that day? The question hung in the room. Carter looked away. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he began telling a different story. A story that was not a confession, but not the same story he had told for 40 years. He admitted Laura had been upset. He admitted they argued. He admitted he followed her after she left. He admitted being near the abandoned road. For investigators, those admissions were enormous, because for the first time, Michael Carter placed himself inside the timeline. He was no longer a distant witness. He was part of the final moments. But detectives knew there was still more. They asked about the property. They asked about the evidence. They asked about the remains. Carter became quiet again. Then he said something unexpected. I never planned for this. The room became silent. Detectives knew they had reached a turning point, because those words contained something they had been searching for. Not innocence, not denial, awareness. A person does not say they never planned for something unless they understand exactly what happened. The interview continued. Carter finally admitted he had hidden information. He admitted he lied. He admitted he knew more than he told investigators. But he still tried to separate himself from the worst parts of the crime. He claimed the situation became out of control. He claimed he never intended for Laura to die. He claimed everything happened in a moment of panic. Investigators listened carefully, because after 40 years, they were finally hearing his version of events. But they also knew something important. A confession does not erase evidence, and evidence tells its own story. The trial preparation began soon after. Prosecutors built their case around decades of accumulated evidence. The fingerprint from the vehicle, the witness accounts, the recovered remains, the timeline, the contradictions, the hidden journal, the phone call that reopened the case. A case that had survived because every person involved had carried a different piece of the truth. And when those pieces finally came together, the picture became clear. But as prosecutors prepared for court, another shocking discovery emerged. A discovery involving the second person connected to that night. Thomas Reed, the witness who waited decades to speak. Investigators reviewed his statements again, and they found something they had missed, a contradiction. A detail that suggested Reed was not only a witness, he may have been closer to the truth than anyone realized, because there was one question nobody had asked. Why was Thomas Reed driving near that abandoned road that night? Why was he there at exactly the wrong moment? And why did he wait 40 years before telling anyone? The investigation that seemed finished suddenly had another unanswered question. The final chapter of Laura Bennett's story was approaching, but before justice could arrive, detectives had to uncover the truth about everyone who stood near the darkness. Because sometimes the hardest part of solving a cold case is not finding the person responsible. It is discovering how many people helped the truth stay hidden. And after 40 years, the silence was finally breaking. The final chapter of the Laura Bennett investigation did not begin with an arrest. It began with a question that had haunted detectives since the first day the case was reopened. How many people knew the truth? Because after 40 years, investigators had learned something terrifying. A mystery does not survive for 4 decades because there are no answers. Sometimes it survives because too many people know the answers and choose silence. For years, the disappearance of Laura Bennett had been described as a case with no witnesses, no clear suspect, no explanation. But the truth was far more complicated. There were people who saw pieces of what happened, people who remembered strange details, people who noticed suspicious behavior, people who carried information that could have changed everything. And now, one by one, those people were finally speaking. The attention returned to Thomas Reed, the man whose phone call had reopened the case, the man who had carried his memory of that night for nearly 40 years. At first, investigators considered Reed a hero, the person who finally broke the silence, the person who gave Laura's family the answers they had been waiting for. But as detectives examined every detail of his story, they discovered something they could not ignore. Reed knew more than he originally admitted, much more. The investigators returned to his first interview. They reviewed every sentence, every pause, every moment where he avoided a question, and they noticed a pattern. Reed had not lied about everything, but he had hidden certain details, important details, details that place him closer to the events of October 17th, 1983. When detectives questioned him again, the atmosphere changed. This time, they were not asking for memories. They were asking for the truth. They asked why he was near the abandoned service road. They asked why he waited until now to come forward. They asked why he never mentioned seeing Carter's truck during the original investigation. Reed looked exhausted. After decades of carrying the secret, the weight had finally become impossible to hold. He admitted he was afraid. But then he admitted something else, something that changed the case. He said Michael Carter was not the only person who was there that night. There was another vehicle, another person, someone who had never appeared in the investigation, someone who helped create the silence that followed. The revelation sent detectives back through old records. They searched employment documents, old addresses, connections between people involved in the case. And eventually, they found a missing link, a person named Robert Hayes. In 1983, Hayes was a close friend of Michael Carter. He owned a small business near the repair shop. He had known Carter for years. And according to investigators, he was one of the few people Carter trusted. But his name had never appeared in the original investigation because nobody knew there was a reason to look. That changed after Reed's statement. Detectives contacted Hayes. At first, he refused to cooperate. He claimed he knew nothing about Laura Bennett. He claimed he barely remembered Michael Carter. But investigators already knew something. People rarely forget events that involve a missing person, especially when those events happen the night before everything changes. After several interviews, Hayes finally admitted he knew more than he had revealed. He admitted Carter contacted him after Laura disappeared. He admitted Carter asked for help, not directly, not with a confession, but with a request to remove something from his truck, a request that Hayes claimed he did not fully understand at the time. Investigators asked what he removed. Hayes remained silent. Then he said the words that shocked everyone, something that belonged to her. The room went quiet, because after decades of searching, detectives finally understood the structure of the secret. Michael Carter had not hidden the truth alone. He had created a circle of silence, a circle built from fear, loyalty, and people convincing themselves they were not responsible. The investigation shifted again. Prosecutors now had a complete picture. Michael Carter was the person connected to Laura's final moments. He was the person whose fingerprint was found inside her vehicle. He was the person whose truck appeared near the scene. He was the person who lied about his movements. But he was also protected by people who chose not to speak. The evidence was overwhelming. And eventually, Michael Carter was arrested. The news spread across Missouri within hours. A cold case solved. A mystery that had lasted decades finally reaching its conclusion. People who remembered Laura gathered again. The same streets where investigators once searched. The same community that once covered its windows with missing person posters. Now filled with the sound of a different story. A story about justice. But for Laura's family, the moment was complicated. Because justice does not erase 40 years. It does not return birthdays. It does not bring back conversations. It does not replace the life that was lost. The arrest gave them answers. But it also forced them to face the reality they had feared since 1983. Laura was never coming home. The trial became one of the most watched criminal cases in the region. The courtroom was filled with decades of evidence. Photographs from 1983, forensic reports, witness testimony, old recordings, the fingerprint that waited 40 years, the phone call that changed everything. The prosecution presented a simple message. The truth was never gone. It was always there, buried inside the evidence, waiting for someone to find it. The defense argued that memories faded, that witnesses were unreliable, that decades had passed. They questioned the investigation. They questioned the evidence. They questioned whether the truth could survive so much time. But the jury saw something different. They saw a pattern of lies, a pattern of hidden information, a pattern that connected every forgotten piece of evidence. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came, guilty. The courtroom was silent, then emotional. For Laura's family, the moment represented something they had waited almost their entire lives to hear: accountability. The case that began with a missing person poster had finally reached its final page. But even after the conviction, the story of Laura Bennett remained a warning, because the greatest mystery was not how the evidence was lost. It was how many people saw the truth and looked away. The fingerprint did not solve the case by itself. The phone call did not solve the case by itself. The witness statements did not solve the case by themselves. It was every piece, every forgotten detail, every person who finally decided silence was no longer acceptable. Together, they brought Laura's story back. 40 years after a young woman disappeared on a quiet Missouri road, the world finally learned what happened. The cold case was no longer cold. The unanswered questions finally had answers. But the memory of that night remained. The empty road, the abandoned vehicle, the missing woman whose name stayed alive through decades of uncertainty. And the phone call at 2:13 in the morning that changed everything. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear. Sometimes it waits. It waits inside old evidence boxes, inside forgotten photographs, inside memories people are afraid to share, and sometimes after decades of silence. One voice is enough to bring the entire story back. Laura Bennett's case was finally solved, but the lesson left behind would remain forever. A mystery can sleep for years. A secret can hide for decades. But the truth has a way of finding its way home. The verdict brought an ending to the courtroom battle, but it did not erase the years that came before. For the people who had lived through the disappearance of Laura Bennett, the conclusion of the case was not simply a headline. It was a final chapter of a story that had shaped an entire community for nearly half a century. Because behind every piece of evidence was a human memory. Behind every photograph was a moment that someone wished they could return to. Behind every unanswered question was a family that had spent decades trapped between hope and grief. The name Laura Bennett had never disappeared, even when the investigation went quiet, even when the files were moved into storage, even when people stopped talking about the case. Laura remained. Her photographs stayed on walls. Her story stayed in newspaper archives. Her disappearance became one of those mysteries people whispered about whenever old cases were discussed. A reminder that some questions can survive longer than anyone expects. But after the arrest of Michael Carter, the community began looking back at the investigation differently. People wondered how close the truth had been all along, how many opportunities had existed, how many moments could have changed the outcome. The fingerprint was there. The witness memories were there. The strange behavior was there. The hidden documents were there. The evidence had not vanished. It had simply been waiting for the right moment. And that moment finally arrived when one person picked up the phone. A single decision. A single conversation. A single voice breaking through 40 years of silence. Investigators later said that cold cases are rarely solved by one miracle discovery. They are solved when forgotten pieces finally connect. Laura Bennett's case was exactly that. A fingerprint collected in 1983. A technology breakthrough decades later. A witness who decided fear could no longer control him. A journal entry written by someone who could not forget what she saw. A photograph hidden away in storage. A property that held the final evidence. Every piece existed separately, but together they created the truth. The most emotional moment came when Laura's family was finally allowed to see the recovered evidence from the investigation. Not because they wanted to relive the pain, but because they wanted to understand. For decades, they had lived with an empty space, an unanswered question sitting at the center of every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday. They had imagined thousands of possibilities. Maybe Laura had left. Maybe she was somewhere else. Maybe someone would find her. Maybe one day the phone would ring. And after all those years, the phone did ring. But it brought a truth they had waited and feared at the same time. The truth was painful, but uncertainty was its own kind of suffering. Finally, they knew. Finally, Laura's story was complete. Investigators who worked the final stages of the case said the most difficult part was not finding the evidence. It was understanding how long the truth had been hidden. 40 years is an extraordinary amount of time. A child can grow into an adult. A town can change completely. Buildings can disappear. Roads can be rebuilt. People can move away. But one thing remained unchanged. The question, what happened to Laura Bennett? That question followed investigators from one generation to another. The detectives who reopened the case inherited the work of those who came before them. Some of the original investigators had retired. Some had passed away. Some never saw the answer. But their work mattered. The photographs they took. The evidence they preserved. The interviews they recorded. Those decisions allowed future investigators to finish what they started. Because solving a cold case is not only about the person who finally finds the answer. It is about every person who refused to let the case disappear. Years after conviction, investigators still talk about the strange path that led to the truth. Not a single dramatic moment. Not one perfect clue. But a chain of events. A chain that began with a missing woman. A chain that ended with justice. The old repair shop where Michael Carter once worked became a symbol of the case. A place where ordinary life continued while an extraordinary secret remained hidden. People who drove past it for years never knew what had happened there. They never knew that behind those walls existed a connection to one of Missouri's most haunting mysteries. They never knew that a simple fingerprint would eventually expose the truth. That small detail became the symbol of the entire investigation. A reminder that evidence does not have an expiration date. A reminder that time does not always protect those who hide the truth. Because technology changes, investigators change, but evidence remains. And sometimes the smallest piece of evidence becomes the loudest voice. The story of Laura Bennett also changed the way local authorities looked at unsolved cases. Old files were reviewed. Stored evidence was re-examined. Families of missing people reached out again. The success of one investigation gave hope to others, because every cold case represents someone waiting, someone searching, someone who still believes an answer exists. And that belief was exactly what kept Laura's case alive. The community that once searched the roads and fields of Missouri eventually gathered for a different reason, not to look for Laura, but to remember her. People brought photographs, shared memories, told stories. They talked about who she was before she became a name on a missing person report, before she became a cold case, before her disappearance became a mystery. They remembered Laura as a person, a daughter, a friend, a woman with plans and dreams. Because behind every investigation headline is a life. And Laura Bennett was more than a case file. She was someone who mattered, someone who was loved, someone whose story deserved to be told. The final words spoken by investigators after the case ended were simple. The truth may be delayed, but it is never forgotten. Because somewhere, someone remembers. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Someone carries a piece of the story. And sometimes after decades of silence, that person finally decides to speak. That was what happened in Missouri. A phone rang in the middle of the night. A voice revealed a secret. A forgotten fingerprint found a name. And a cold case that had haunted a community for 40 years finally reached its conclusion. The road where Laura disappeared no longer represented only mystery. It represented something else. Persistence. Hope. And the belief that no case is truly finished as long as someone is still searching. The world moved forward after Laura Bennett's case was solved. New stories replaced old headlines. New investigations took the attention of the public, but the memory remained. Because some cases are not remembered because of how they ended. They are remembered because of how long people waited for the truth. Laura Bennett's story lasted 40 years. 40 years of questions. 40 years of silence. 40 years waiting for one moment that would change everything. And finally that moment came. Not with a dramatic discovery in the beginning. Not with a witness who appeared immediately. But with a simple phone call. A phone call that proved one thing. The truth can be buried. The truth can be delayed. The truth can be ignored. But the truth has a way of returning. And when it does, it changes everything. Years after the final verdict, the name Laura Bennett continued to echo through Missouri. Not because of the person who was convicted. Not because of the shocking discoveries that reopened the case. But because her story became a reminder of something far more powerful. That even the quietest voices can eventually be heard. For decades, Laura's disappearance represented everything people feared about unsolved cases. A person could vanish. A family could wait. A community could search. And still, the truth could remain hidden. The world moved on. New headlines replaced old ones. New crimes demanded attention. New investigations filled the news. But behind the scenes, Laura's name remained inside a file that nobody was willing to forget. The investigators who reopened the case often described it as a battle against time. Not just because evidence becomes harder to find. Not just because memories become weaker. But because every year that passes creates another layer between the truth and the people searching for it. Buildings disappear. Records are lost. People move away. Witnesses grow older. Sometimes, The only thing left behind is a single detail, a fingerprint, a photograph, a sentence written in an old journal, a memory someone was too afraid to share. And sometimes that one detail is enough. The fingerprint found inside Laura's vehicle became more than evidence. It became a symbol. A symbol that the past does not disappear simply because people stopped talking about it. That fingerprint had been sitting quietly for decades. Nobody knew whose it was. Nobody knew what it meant. But it waited. It waited for technology to catch up. It waited for investigators to ask the right questions. It waited for the moment when the truth was finally ready to be uncovered. And when that moment came, everything changed. The investigators who worked on the case said the most difficult part was accepting that the answers had existed all along. The evidence had been there. The clues had been there. The connections had been there. The missing piece was not the evidence. It was time. It was courage. It was someone finally deciding that silence had lasted long enough. The phone call that reopened the case became one of the most talked about moments in the investigation. A simple call in the middle of the night. No cameras. No reporters. No dramatic announcement. Just a person finally admitting that they could no longer carry the weight of the past. That call did not solve the case by itself, but opened the door. And once that door opened, everything that had been hidden began coming out. The forgotten witnesses, the old documents, the evidence that had been stored away, the memories people thought no longer mattered. Each piece brought investigators closer. Each piece revealed another part of Laura's final days. And each piece proved something important. A cold case is never truly cold. It is only waiting. Waiting for someone to return. Waiting for someone to look again. Waiting for someone to notice what everyone else missed. The community around Jefferson County changed after the case ended. People who had lived with a mystery for years finally had an answer. But answers do not always bring peace immediately. For some, the conclusion brought relief. For others, it brought sadness. Because solving a case does not change what happened. It does not bring back the moments that were lost. It does not return the years that families spent waiting. Justice quand arrive. But time cannot be recovered. That was the hardest reality surrounding Laura Bennett's story. The investigation succeeded. The truth emerged. The person responsible was held accountable. But the years between 1983 and the final resolution remained. 40 years of birthdays without Laura. 40 years of empty chairs. 40 years of wondering. Those years became part of the story too. Because every missing person case is more than evidence, more than police reports, more than courtroom arguments. It is about people. People who loved someone. People who searched. People who waited. People who refused to let a name disappear. And that was why Laura Bennett's story continued to matter. She was never just a headline. She was never just a cold case. She was a person whose life had meaning long before investigators ever opened a file. Long before her name appeared in newspapers. Long before her disappearance became a mystery. In the years following conviction, detectives continued reviewing other unsolved cases. The lessons from Laura's investigation influenced how old evidence was handled, how forgotten witnesses were contacted, how investigators approached cases that seemed impossible. Because one solved cold case creates hope for another. Every breakthrough tells families that answers can still come, even after decades. Even after everyone begins to believe the truth is gone. The story of Laura Bennett became proof that time does not always protect secrets. Sometimes time exposes them. People who believe they had escaped attention can find themselves facing questions years later. Memories they buried can return. Evidence they ignored can become the strongest proof against them. And the past they tried to leave behind can suddenly become impossible to escape. That was the final lesson of the Missouri cold case. The truth does not need to arrive quickly to matter. It only needs to arrive. For Laura Bennett, it arrived after 40 years. It arrived through technology, through determination, through witnesses finding the courage to speak, through investigators who refused to accept that an unanswered question was the same as an unsolvable one. The road where Laura was last seen remained quiet. Cars continued passing. People continued traveling through the same areas where the mystery began. But the meaning of that road had changed. It was no longer only a place connected to tragedy. It was a place connected to perseverance. A place that proved forgotten stories can still be recovered. A place that showed justice sometimes moves slowly, but it can still arrive. The case that once carried the words unsolved and missing eventually carried different words. Solved, remembered, completed. And behind those words was a story of patience, a story of pain, a story of people who refused to stop searching. Because the greatest victories in criminal investigations are not always the dramatic arrests. Sometimes the greatest victory is giving a family the answer they spent decades waiting to hear. Sometimes it is bringing a name back into the light. Sometimes it is proving that no matter how much time passes, no person is ever truly forgotten. The phone call came at 2:13 in the morning, a moment that lasted only seconds. But those seconds changed everything. They reopened a case. They uncovered a secret. They restored a truth that had been hidden for almost half a century. And they proved something investigators, families, and communities around the world continue to believe. A cold case may sleep. A mystery may remain silent. A secret may survive for years. But eventually, someone remembers. Someone speaks. And the truth finds its way home.